start this week's reflection by reading the Gospel reading. It's Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. When Jesus again crossed over the other side, a large crowd gathered while he was by the lake. One of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and he pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. Now a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Instead of getting better, she just grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him and in the crowd, and she touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realised that power had gone out of him, and he turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came forward, and trembling with fear, she told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." And while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter's dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He didn't let anyone follow him except Peter, James and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with the people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples, and he went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished, and he gave them strict orders to let no one know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Last week, our reflection was how Jesus had been teaching his disciples, and then he said, "Now row across to the other side of the lake." And because Jesus had said to do this, they set out, believing they'd get to the other side of the lake. But a huge storm blew up and they lost faith, believing that they were going to drown. And after Jesus calmed the storm, he questioned them about, "Why did you doubt?" Now this week's reading has two stories in one, but they are both about having faith in Jesus. The first one mentioned was an important person. He was the leader of the synagogue, which meant he had great responsibilities and quite a well-known person. And we can tell that by the fact that his name was given, Jairus. He was also somebody in a desperate situation. His little daughter was very ill and dying. But it would have been difficult for him to go to Jesus because by now the Jewish leaders and most of the religious leaders were very anti-Jesus. And so here's the leader of the synagogue wanting to go to Jesus for help. He could have jeopardised his whole position by doing that. But he was also somebody who showed he really believed that Jesus could heal his daughter. Because when he came, he said to Jesus, "Please come and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live." It says he pleaded earnestly. And he wasn't just seeing Jesus as a last resort, a last possibility, saying, "Oh, please, can you do anything for her?" He fully believed that if Jesus laid his hands on her, she would live. Jesus agreed to go, and he set off with the crowd around him. And this is where we get introduced to the second person. This person's a woman. She's nameless. We never know who she is. And she's one who'd had an issue of bleeding for 12 years. Now, a woman during her menstrual period was deemed unclean, and she wasn't able to go into the temple or a synagogue, and she needed to avoid contact with other people, because if she contacted them, they would become ritually unclean and they wouldn't be able to go into the temple or synagogue for 7 days, and so on. So this poor woman with constant bleeding meant she was a complete and constant outcast. On top of that, she'd spent everything she had on doctors trying to heal, but nothing had helped her. But she had faith. She had faith that Jesus could heal her, because she said, if I could just make my way through the crowd and touch his clothes, I'll be healed. She did that, and she felt immediately that she was healed. But Jesus also felt something. He knew that power had gone out of him, and he knew that something must have happened to someone, and so he stopped. And he said, who touched me? And this is where the disciples said, oh, come on, Jesus, look at the crowd all around you, and you're asking who touched you? But the woman knew that he meant something more specific. And despite her fear that the crowd would perhaps turn on her, she spoke up. And Jesus' response to her was, well, your faith has made you well, whole. It's then that some people came from Jairus' house and said, look, don't bother Jesus anymore, your daughter has died. No point in bothering you. But Jesus overheard them saying this to Jairus and said, no, don't be afraid, just believe. And so they set off. This time he dismissed the crowd and just took a few of his disciples. When he got to the house, the official mourners were already in full wail, and he said to them, what are you doing? He said, the child's not dead, she's just asleep. And they laughed at him, don't be ridiculous. So he sent them packing. He couldn't have unbelief around him when he was about to do what he was about to do. He took the parents and the few disciples into the room with the child, took her by the hand and told her to get up, which she did. She stood up, she started to walk around, and Jesus said, okay, now get her something to eat. Both these people were in desperate need, desperate circumstances, and they turned to Jesus in their desperation. However, they weren't just turning to him with a vague hope, well, maybe Jesus can do something, I've tried everything else. They both understood and believed that Jesus could help them. There's an important combination here. There's desperation and there's faith. And what desperation does is it focuses our mind on what really matters at the moment. When we pray to God in desperation, we're really praying from the heart. It's very easy to ask God to bless Aunt Agatha or to pray for world peace, but those prayers can be nothing more than words, just perhaps a vague wish. There's no real passion behind them. Passionate prayer is what comes from the heart. This is a type of prayer that will bring great answers. And there's a great example of this in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Hannah could not conceive and have children, and she was constantly being tormented by her husband's other wife, Peninnah, who had children. And so Hannah was getting very miserable. And one time when the family was doing their annual sacrifice and worship, Hannah went alone into the sanctuary and she just poured out her heart to God. She didn't voice the words, but she was sort of speaking words. Her lips were moving. And so the priest Eli said, oh, she must be drunk, and he scolded her. But her reply is, I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. And Eli's response was, well, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him. And then we read that Hannah went home. She conceived and she gave birth to Samuel, the great prophet. God answered the prayer that came pouring from Hannah's heart. When that sort of prayer combines with faith that believes that Jesus has the answer, then great answers can come. Do we have the faith to believe that Jesus has the answer? And do we pray with passion?
Be still, there is a healer. His love is deeper than the sea. His mercy is unfailing. His arms, fortress for the weak. I lift my hands to believe again.